What kind of person throws hot coffee at a child and then asks for her to be fired? The question hung in the air long before anyone dared to answer it, because in that moment, high above Manhattan on a rooftop restaurant glowing with gold light and polished glass, something far heavier than a spilled drink had just shattered. Aaliyah Brooks was only 8 years old, her small hands wrapped around a tray she could barely balance, the weight of it pulling at her thin arms as she stepped carefully between tables where dinners cost more than her mother made in a day. She wasn't supposed to be there, not really, but when your mom works double shifts washing dishes in a place like this, sometimes you learn to stay quiet, stay helpful, stay invisible. That was the rule. Stay invisible and nothing bad happens. But invisibility doesn't always protect you. Sometimes, it makes you easier to overlook when something does. The skyline stretched endlessly behind the glass railing, the Empire State Building glowing in the distance, but no one was looking at the view anymore. Every eye had turned to table 12. Vanessa Whitmore sat there like she owned the night, her white designer dress untouched by a single wrinkle, diamonds catching the light every time she moved her hand. The kind of woman who didn't wait for attention because attention came to her. And when Aaliyah stepped too close, just a fraction too close, that was all it took. A flick of a wrist, a sharp, careless motion. The cup tipped. The dark liquid arced through the air. Then came the sound. Not loud, not dramatic, just the soft, unmistakable splash of something going very wrong. Aaliyah froze. The tray slipped from her fingers, glasses clattering against the floor as her breath caught in her throat, her small frame stiffening as warmth soaked through the front of her uniform. For a second, she didn't even cry. It was the shock, the confusion, the way her brain tried to understand what had just happened before her body could react. Then her face tightened, her lips trembled, and the tears came, not loud, not screaming, just quiet, uncontrollable crying that made it harder somehow because it wasn't anger, it was hurt, real hurt, the kind no one in that room wanted to claim responsibility for. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks hovered in the air. A man at the next table slowly lowered his phone, though not before recording a few seconds too long. A server took half a step forward, then stopped. Because this wasn't just any table, and this wasn't just any guest. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, glancing down at the girl like she was an inconvenience, not a human being. Her voice cut clean through the silence, smooth and cold. She should have been more careful. No apology. No concern. Just a statement as if that settled everything. And maybe, in a place like this, it usually did. Aaliyah tried to wipe her shirt with shaking hands, but it only made it worse, spreading the stain. Her breathing uneven as she looked around, searching, hoping someone would step in, someone would say something, someone would tell her it wasn't her fault. But no one moved, no one spoke, because power has a way of deciding who gets defended and who gets ignored. And at the center of it all, just a few tables away, sat Daniel Kong. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the table. He didn't even stand. He simply watched, one hand loosely holding a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the same light that danced across the skyline behind him. His expression unreadable, his posture relaxed, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. And that was the moment everyone misunderstood him. The silence did not break right away. It stretched, thin and fragile, like glass that could shatter with a single wrong word. And in that suspended moment, Aaliyah's quiet sobbing became the loudest sound in the entire restaurant. A small, trembling rhythm that no one could ignore, yet no one seemed willing to answer, while Vanessa Whitmore calmly reached for her napkin and dabbed at the edge of her perfectly painted lips as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Her movements slow, controlled, practiced, the kind of composure that came from never being challenged. And when she finally looked up again, her eyes did not go to the child but to the manager approaching with hurried steps and a carefully constructed smile that tried to balance concern with calculation, because in a place like this every reaction had a cost and every decision had a price, and he already knew which side of the scale weighed more. "Is there a problem, Miss Whitmore?" he asked softly, his voice respectful, almost deferential. And that was all the invitation she needed. "Yes," she said, her tone sharp but measured. "There is. Your staff clearly does not know how to move without causing disruption." And she gestured lightly toward Aaliyah as if pointing to a misplaced object rather than a person. I nearly had my dress ruined, she added, even though not a single drop had touched her, and the manager nodded quickly, his eyes flicking once toward the child, taking in the soaked uniform, the shaking hands, the tears that would not stop, but only for a second, because holding that gaze too long might require him to acknowledge something he had already decided to ignore. I am very sorry for the inconvenience, he said, turning fully toward Vanessa. We will handle it immediately. And with that one sentence the direction of the room shifted, subtle but undeniable, because now it was clear who mattered and who did not. Aaliyah tried to speak, her voice small and unsteady. I did not mean to, she whispered, the words barely forming as her throat tightened, but they fell into the space between people who were no longer listening. Her mother rushed forward from the back hallway, hands still damp from the sink, her apron wrinkled and stained from hours of work, eyes wide with worry as she dropped to her knees beside her daughter. Aaliyah, baby, are you okay? She asked, her voice trembling as she gently touched the fabric of the uniform, checking, reassuring, trying to hold herself together while everything inside her threatened to break. But before she could say more, the manager cleared his throat, not loudly, but firmly enough to interrupt. We need to take this off the floor, he said, not looking at them directly. You cannot stay here. And the words landed heavier than any physical impact could, because they carried something deeper, something colder, the quiet removal of presence, the polite erasure of discomfort. Aaliyah looked up then, not at her mother, not at the manager, but past them across the room, to where Daniel Kong still sat, untouched by the tension. His glass now resting on the table, his fingers still, his expression unchanged, and for a brief second their eyes met, hers searching, pleading in a way she did not even understand, and his unreadable, distant, as if he were watching a scene unfold that did not belong to him. And that was when something inside her shifted, not hope, not exactly, but the fragile belief that maybe someone would step in began to fade, because even the most powerful man in the room had chosen to remain silent, and silence, in a moment like this, felt louder than anything anyone could say. The air did not move even after the manager's words settled. It thickened, heavier than before, as if the entire rooftop had agreed to pretend that what just happened was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, something to be cleared away quickly before it ruined the evening. And yet the tension refused to disappear. It lingered in the way people avoided looking directly at Aaliyah and her mother, in the way forks resumed their movement just a little too slowly, in the way conversations restarted with forced laughter that sounded hollow against the quiet weight of what everyone had just witnessed. And through it all Daniel Kong remained seated, his posture unchanged, but something subtle had shifted, not in his body, but in the rhythm of his attention, because while his eyes had turned away before, now they returned, not to the center of the scene, but to the edges of it, to the details most people missed, the position of the fallen glass, the angle of the table, the distance between where Aaliyah had been standing and where the cup had landed, small things, insignificant on their own, but together they formed a question that did not sit comfortably in his mind. And Daniel was not a man who ignored questions, not the important ones. His fingers tapped once against the table, a quiet sound, almost lost beneath the ambient music, but deliberate, controlled, the kind of movement that signaled thought rather than reaction. And across from him an empty chair remained untouched, a silent reminder of Vanessa Whitmore's presence in his life, her laughter from earlier still echoing faintly in his memory, polished and effortless, the kind of laughter that fit perfectly in places like this. And yet now, when he glanced in her direction, something did not align. Her posture too relaxed, her expression too composed, no trace of surprise, no flicker of discomfort, only a faint impatience as she checked her reflection in the black screen of her phone, adjusting a strand of hair as if the situation unfolding around her was beneath her attention. And that was when the first real crack appeared, not visible to anyone else, but unmistakable within him, because Daniel had spent years reading people, understanding intention in the smallest gestures, and what he saw now did not match the story he had initially accepted, the story that said a careless child had made a mistake, that accidents happened, that order needed to be restored, but accidents left traces. They carried confusion, apologies, movement, and none of that had been present, only control, only dismissal, only a narrative declared without question. And as that realization settled, his gaze shifted again, this time toward Aaliyah, who stood slightly behind her mother now, her small hands clutching the fabric of the apron, as if it were the only solid thing left in a room that had quietly turned against her. Her breathing uneven, her eyes red, but what held him was not her fear. It was the way she kept glancing down at the floor, not in guilt, but in uncertainty, as if trying to understand how something so small had become something so overwhelming. And in that moment Daniel recognized something he had not expected, not in her, but in himself, a hesitation, a pause between what he thought he knew and what he was beginning to question, and it unsettled him more than the scene itself, because for a man who built his world on certainty, doubt was not a comfortable place to stand. And yet there he was, sitting in the center of power, surrounded by wealth and control, and for the first time that evening he was not entirely sure what had just happened, and that uncertainty began to pull him, slowly, deliberately, toward a truth that no one else in the room seemed willing to see. The uncertainty did not fade, it sharpened, like a quiet edge forming beneath the surface of Daniel Kang's calm exterior, and for the first time that evening his stillness was no longer indifference but restraint, a deliberate holding back of something that had not yet fully taken shape, because what he was seeing no longer matched what he had accepted only moments before, and that kind of mismatch was something he had learned, over years of navigating power and deception, never to ignore. His gaze moved again, slower now, more precise, tracing the scene not as a bystander but as someone reconstructing it piece by piece. The fallen glass was not where it should have been if it had slipped naturally. The liquid had spread in a direction that suggested force rather than accident, and most telling of all, Vanessa Whitmore remained untouched. Not a single stain on her dress, not a single sign that she had been caught in the same moment she was now describing as careless chaos. And that detail settled heavily in his mind, because accidents did not choose sides so cleanly. They did not spare one person completely while marking another so clearly, and yet he had accepted that version without question. He had allowed the room's silent consensus to guide his judgment, and that realization did not sit well with him, not at all. Across the floor the manager had already begun to usher Aaliyah and her mother toward the back, his voice low but firm, repeating the same polite phrases, that disguised dismissal as procedure. "We will take care of this in the staff area," he said, though everyone understood what that really meant. Remove the problem, restore the atmosphere, protect the experience of those who mattered, and Aaliyah followed, her steps small and uneven, her head lowered now, no longer searching the room for help, because something inside her had already adjusted to the absence of it, and that quiet resignation struck Daniel more than anything else had so far. Not the spilled coffee, not the manager's decision, but the way a child could so quickly learn that speaking up would not change anything. And it stirred something deeper, something older, something he had spent years burying beneath control and discipline. A memory he did not invite but could not fully push away, of another small figure standing in a place she did not belong, of another moment where silence had cost more than words ever could, and for a fraction of a second his hand tightened slightly around the edge of the table. The only outward sign that the internal balance he maintained so carefully was beginning to shift. Meanwhile Vanessa leaned back in her chair again, crossing one leg over the other, her expression relaxed, almost bored, as if the entire incident had already been resolved in her favor. And when one of her friends leaned in to whisper something, she smiled, a soft, dismissive curve of her lips that carried no trace of concern, only the quiet confidence of someone who had never been told no. And that smile, more than anything else, completed the pattern Daniel had been piecing together, because it confirmed what the physical details had suggested, what the inconsistencies had implied, what his instincts had begun to question. This had not been an accident, not in the way it had been presented, and the weight of that realization settled into place with a clarity that erased the last remnants of his earlier assumption. But clarity did not immediately lead to action, not for him, because Daniel Kang did not move on impulse. He verified, he confirmed, he understood before he decided, and so he remained seated, outwardly unchanged, while internally the direction of his thinking shifted entirely, from passive observation to active evaluation, from acceptance to scrutiny, and in that quiet transition, unnoticed by most, the balance of the room had already begun to tilt, because the one person whose judgment truly mattered was no longer aligned with the story everyone else believed. And when that kind of shift happened, it rarely stayed invisible for long. The shift inside Daniel Kang did not explode into action. It settled, deeper and more deliberate, like a decision forming beneath layers of control, and while the rest of the room believed the moment had already passed, that order had been restored, that the inconvenience had been removed along with the child and her mother disappearing behind the staff corridor, Daniel's attention did not follow the crowd back to their conversations. It followed the absence they left behind, the empty space where Aaliyah had been standing only seconds ago, and that absence felt louder than the entire restaurant combined, because it carried with it a question that now refused to be ignored, and Daniel was not a man who allowed unanswered questions to remain in his world. His gaze shifted once more, but this time it did not linger on objects or positions. It settled on people, on reactions, on the subtle differences between those who knew something and those who only pretended to. A server near the far wall avoided eye contact entirely, her hands moving too quickly as she wiped a perfectly clean surface. Another employee stood frozen for half a second longer than necessary before turning away, and those small hesitations, those almost invisible cracks in behavior, spoke louder than any statement could have, because they suggested awareness, not confusion, knowledge, not assumption, and Daniel recognized that pattern immediately. It was the pattern of people who had seen something they were not supposed to acknowledge, and that realization tightened the quiet tension within him just enough to make his next movement inevitable, not sudden, not dramatic, but certain. He reached for his glass again, not to drink, but to place it down with precision, the soft sound against the table marking a transition only he fully understood. Across from him, Vanessa continued her effortless composure, now engaged in light conversation with her companions, her voice smooth, her laughter controlled, as if the entire situation had been reduced to nothing more than an unfortunate distraction already resolved. And when she briefly glanced toward the staff corridor, there was no concern in her eyes, no curiosity, only dismissal, as if whatever happened beyond that doorway no longer deserved her attention, and that, more than anything else, confirmed what Daniel needed to know, because people who were innocent of wrongdoing often looked back, even briefly, even unconsciously. But Vanessa did not. She had already moved on, and that absence of reaction was its own kind of evidence. Meanwhile, the manager returned to the dining floor, adjusting his jacket, smoothing his expression back into something presentable, something controlled, but there was a flicker beneath it, a tension that had not been there before, and when his eyes passed over Daniel's table for a fraction of a second, they did not linger. They avoided, quickly, instinctively, and that avoidance did not go unnoticed. It never did. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture still relaxed, still composed, but now entirely intentional, every movement measured, every observation aligning into a clearer understanding of what had truly occurred. He had misjudged the situation, not completely, but enough to allow something unacceptable to pass without immediate correction, and that realization did not trigger anger. Not yet. It triggered something colder, something more precise, the need to correct the imbalance, to realign the truth with what had been falsely presented, and unlike others in that room, Daniel Kong did not rely on assumption once doubt had entered the equation. He relied on confirmation, on evidence, on clarity, and as his gaze finally shifted toward the hallway where Aaliyah had been taken, the decision formed. Fully, not rushed, not emotional, but inevitable, because in a world built on power, the most dangerous moment was not when power acted loudly. It was when it chose to move quietly, with purpose, and in that moment, without a single raised voice or dramatic gesture, Daniel Kong had already decided that what happened tonight would not end the way everyone else expected. Daniel Kong did not stand immediately, and that was what made the moment heavier than if he had, because while most people associated power with speed, with reaction, with visible control, Daniel understood something far more dangerous, that true authority did not rush. It observed until movement became unavoidable, and as the soft hum of conversation slowly returned around him, he remained still for a few seconds longer, long enough for everyone to believe he had chosen to ignore what happened, long enough for Vanessa Whitmore to relax completely back into her version of reality, her laughter rising again, light and effortless, blending into the music as if the past few minutes had already been erased. But inside Daniel, nothing had been erased, everything had been reorganized, every detail placed into a structure that now pointed in a very different direction from where it began, and once that structure settled, once the uncertainty had transformed into clarity, he moved, not abruptly, not with force, but with quiet intention. His chair slid back with a soft, controlled sound that cut through the surrounding noise more effectively than any raised voice could have. And the subtle shift it created was immediate, not because of the sound itself, but because of who had made it. Conversations faltered again, eyes turned without meaning to, and even those who did not know his name felt something change in the air. The kind of change that could not be explained but could not be ignored. Daniel adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, a small, precise motion, then stepped away from the table, not toward Vanessa, not toward the center of attention, but toward the hallway where Aaliyah and her mother had been taken, and that direction alone carried more weight than any confrontation would have, because it broke the expectation that had been silently agreed upon, that the situation was over, that the narrative had been decided, that nothing more needed to be done. And as he walked, unhurried, measured, the manager noticed, of course he did, his posture stiffening almost instantly, his eyes widening just enough to reveal that whatever confidence he had moments before was no longer stable. "Mr. Kong," he called out, his voice careful, attempting to maintain composure while stepping forward, intercepting the path just slightly, not enough to block, but enough to signal concern. "There is no need for you to involve yourself, we have already handled the situation." And the phrasing was deliberate, designed to reassure, to close the matter, to keep everything contained. But Daniel did not stop, not fully. He paused just long enough to acknowledge the words without accepting them. His gaze meeting the manager's, calm, unreadable, but no longer distant, and when he spoke, his voice was low, even, carrying none of the volume that people often expected from authority. But every word landed with unmistakable weight. "Handled," he repeated, not as agreement, but as a question, a single word that forced the manager's explanation to exist under scrutiny, and in that brief pause that followed, the imbalance of the situation became visible, because the manager realized, perhaps too late, that what he had defined as resolution might not align with what Daniel Kong considered acceptable. The guest was satisfied. The manager added quickly, attempting to reinforce his decision, and that was when Daniel's expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for most to notice, but enough to mark a clear line between what had been and what was about to come, because satisfaction in Daniel's world had never been measured by the comfort of the powerful alone, and without raising his voice, without stepping closer, he answered in a tone that carried something far more final than anger. "That was not my question." And in that moment, the hallway behind them, the place where Aaliyah had been taken, no longer felt like a place of quiet removal. It became something else entirely, the center of a truth that had not yet been allowed to surface, but was no longer being ignored. And as Daniel continued forward, the manager stepping aside without realizing he had already done so, the entire balance of the evening shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but irreversibly, because the one person who had remained silent was no longer choosing to be. The hallway beyond the dining room felt like a different world, the golden glow of the rooftop fading into cooler, dimmer lighting that revealed the parts of the restaurant never meant to be seen, where polished surfaces gave way to stainless steel, quiet conversations replaced by the hum of refrigeration units and the distant clatter of dishes. And it was there that Daniel Kong stepped without hesitation, his presence carrying the same weight even in a space where no guests were meant to follow, because power did not depend on location. It followed the person who held it, and as he moved deeper into the corridor, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Staff members who had been speaking in low voices fell silent, eyes lowering, bodies straightening, as if the air itself had become more structured, more aware. And at the far end, near a small prep station, Aaliyah sat on a metal stool, her legs barely reaching the footrest, her shoulders hunched inward as her mother knelt beside her, carefully dabbing at her shirt with a damp cloth, whispering reassurances that sounded more like promises she hoped were true rather than ones she knew she could keep. And the moment Daniel entered that space, the dynamic changed again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could be felt before it was fully understood, because everyone in that hallway knew who he was, even if they never said his name out loud, and the manager, who had followed just a step behind, now found himself in a position he could not control as easily as he had on the dining floor. "Mr. Kong, it is not necessary to come back here," he said, his voice lower now, less confident, as if the walls themselves demanded a different tone. But Daniel did not respond immediately. His attention fixed on Aaliyah, not as an object in a situation, but as a person within it. his gaze taking in the details he had only glimpsed before, the way her small hands gripped the edge of the stool, the way she tried to remain still even as her breathing betrayed her discomfort, the way her mother's movements were both gentle and urgent at the same time. And something in that scene settled deeper into him, not as anger, but as recognition, the kind that did not come from logic alone but from memory, from experience, from moments that never fully disappeared no matter how far one moved from them. And when he finally spoke, his voice remained calm, steady, but no longer distant. "What happened?" he asked, not directing the question at the manager, but at the space itself, at the truth that had been pushed aside. And for a brief second, no one answered, because the difference between being asked and being expected to respond was something everyone in that hallway understood instinctively. The manager stepped forward slightly, attempting to reclaim control. "It was an accident," he said quickly, repeating the version that had already been accepted upstairs. But Daniel's gaze did not shift toward him. It remained on Aaliyah, waiting, and that silence, that refusal to accept the first answer given, created a pressure that no authority from the manager could override, and slowly, almost hesitantly, Aaliyah lifted her head, her eyes meeting Daniel's again. But this time there was something different in them, not hope, not yet, but the fragile awareness that someone was finally asking the question that mattered, and her voice, when it came, was small, careful, as if testing whether it was safe to speak at all. "I did not drop it," she said, the words simple, unpolished, but clear. And the moment they were spoken, the entire room shifted, because truth, even in its quietest form, had a way of changing everything, and Daniel did not react immediately. He did not rush to conclusions or confrontations. He simply absorbed the statement, measured it against everything he had already observed, and in that silent calculation, the last remaining doubt began to dissolve, not completely, not yet, but enough to move him one step closer to the answer he had already started to see. The words did not echo loudly, but they settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore. "I did not drop it?" Aaliyah's voice lingered in the air, fragile yet steady, and for a moment everything seemed to pause around that simple statement, because it did not come with accusation. It did not come with anger. It came with something far more difficult to dismiss, quiet certainty, and Daniel Kong did not look away from her as he processed it, his mind aligning her words with everything he had already observed: the position of the cup, the absence of confusion, the composure of Vanessa, and now, the clarity in the child's voice, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the last fragments of doubt gave way to something more defined, not yet action, but direction, and that direction began to pull him toward a truth that had been deliberately overlooked. Behind him the manager shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change without fully understanding its depth. "She is just upset," he said, attempting to soften the statement, to reshape it into something less disruptive. "Children sometimes misunderstand situations." And the phrasing was careful, designed to redirect responsibility without appearing harsh, but Daniel did not acknowledge it, not because he had not heard, but because it no longer held relevance. Instead he took a small step closer, not invading, not imposing, but narrowing the distance just enough to make his presence more personal, more direct. And when he spoke again his voice remained calm, but carried a precision that left no room for dismissal. "Look at me," he said gently, not as a command, but as an invitation, and Aaliyah hesitated. For only a second before lifting her eyes again, meeting his gaze fully this time, and in that brief connection something shifted, something subtle but undeniable, because for the first time since the incident began, she was not being spoken about, she was being spoken to, and that difference mattered more than anything else in that moment. "Tell me exactly what happened," Daniel continued, each word measured, giving her space, giving her time, and she swallowed, her small hands tightening slightly on the edge of the stool as she searched for the right way to explain something that had happened too quickly, too suddenly. "I was holding the tray," she began, her voice still soft but steadier now, "and I stopped because the table was close, and then her hand moved." She paused, not because she did not remember, but because saying it out loud felt like stepping into something she was not sure she was allowed to say. And Daniel did not interrupt. He did not rush her, he simply waited, and that patience created the space she needed to continue. "It hit the cup," she finished, the words simple, unembellished, but clear, and behind Daniel the manager's expression tightened. Not dramatically, but enough to reveal that the version of events he had accepted so quickly was now beginning to unravel. Because this was no longer just a child reacting emotionally. This was a sequence, a description, something that could be examined, confirmed, or disproven, and Daniel understood that immediately, which was why his next movement was not toward Vanessa. Not yet, but toward something far more definitive. "Where are the cameras?" he asked, his tone unchanged, but the question itself shifting the entire direction of the situation because it introduced something that could not be argued with, something that did not rely on perception or interpretation, and the moment the word cameras entered the space, the air changed again, sharper now, more focused, because everyone present understood what that meant. It meant that whatever had been said, whatever had been assumed, was about to be tested against something objective, something final, and for the first time since the incident began, the control that had seemed so firmly in place began to slip, not visibly, not completely, but enough that it could be felt, like a structure starting to loosen under pressure, and Daniel Kong, still calm, still composed, had already taken the next step toward exposing what the room had tried so quickly to hide. The question did not demand an immediate answer, but it did something far more powerful. It removed every possible place to hide, and the moment Daniel Kong asked about the cameras, the hallway no longer felt like a place of quiet containment. It became a threshold, a point where the story that had been carefully shaped upstairs could no longer remain unchallenged, and the manager knew it. His hesitation this time was not subtle. It was visible in the way his shoulders stiffened, in the way his gaze briefly shifted toward the back office before returning to Daniel, calculating, searching for a response that could slow what had already begun. "We do have cameras," he admitted, his voice measured but no longer confident. "But they are mainly for security, not for reviewing minor incidents." And the word minor hung in the air, fragile and misplaced, because nothing about the situation felt small anymore, not after the child's words, not after the sequence of details that no longer aligned, and Daniel did not challenge the wording directly. He did not raise his voice or correct the manager's framing. He simply allowed a brief silence to follow, the kind of silence that made the insufficiency of the explanation obvious without needing to point it out, and then, calmly, with the same controlled tone that had guided every step so far, he responded, "Then we will use them for security." And the statement was not forceful, it was not loud, but it carried finality, the kind that did not invite negotiation, and for a second longer the manager remained still, caught between the version of authority he had exercised earlier and the reality of the authority now standing in front of him. And in that moment of hesitation, the decision was already made, because not responding would be its own kind of answer, and that was something he could not afford. "Of course," he said finally, stepping aside, gesturing toward the small office at the end of the hallway, where a monitor flickered quietly behind a partially open door, and as Daniel moved forward again, the space seemed to narrow, not physically, but in focus, because everything now pointed toward that single room, that single screen, that single piece of truth waiting to be seen. Behind them Aaliyah remained on the stool, her eyes following the movement, not fully understanding what was about to happen, but sensing that something important had shifted, that for the first time since the incident began, the direction was no longer moving away from her. It was moving back toward the moment itself, and her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, a silent reassurance, though her own expression carried uncertainty, hope restrained by experience, while in the dining room above, the atmosphere had not fully returned to normal. Conversations were quieter now, less certain, as if the absence of resolution had left a gap that could not be filled by ignoring it, and Vanessa, still seated, noticed the change, her eyes briefly narrowing as she glanced toward the hallway, not with concern, but with irritation, as if the situation was taking longer than it should have, as if something that should have been finished was still lingering, and that slight shift in her attention, that momentary awareness, marked the beginning of something she had not anticipated, because while she remained unaware of the specifics, the control she had assumed was already secured was beginning to loosen, and down the hallway, just outside the office door, Daniel paused for a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but out of precision, because once the footage was seen, once the truth was no longer filtered through assumption or influence, there would be no returning to the earlier version of events, and as he reached for the door and pushed it open, the faint glow of the monitor reflecting in his eyes, the entire situation crossed an invisible line, from uncertainty into revelation, from narrative into fact, and whatever appeared on that screen next would not just answer a question. It would redefine everything that had already happened.